So once again, welcome everybody. Welcome to the German British Society's evening. It's not every time that we have the privilege of welcoming a Privy Councillor and peer of the realm to join us. So I'm very glad indeed to welcome Gisela Stuart, Baroness Stuart of Edgbaston to tonight's session. She was, as you probably all know, born in Germany, but has spent most of her life in the United Kingdom. She has remained in touch with German affairs. She's a great friend and has been for a long time of the German British Society, has been to, I don't know how many Königswinter conferences. And she is also known, as you know, as one of the advocates of the United Kingdom leaving the European Union. And we've had her before to try and explain this point of view to us, given that most of our members, of course, and friends who attend our meetings regularly would probably still see this as a rather sad development. But on the other hand, members have told us that we should be fair and listen and or digest other viewpoints. And so I'm very grateful to welcome Gisela again to try and do this. Now, she suggested the title that you saw in the invitation, and it's quite intriguing indeed to see and to hear what in 50 years' time might be seen as more sort of difficult, that the UK joined back in 1973 or that UK left the EU in 2019. Gisela Stuart is not only a legislator in the House of Lords, she has also become a civil service regulator. And so she has told us beforehand that there might be a question or something that she is unable to answer on grounds of her position. So don't be surprised if at some point she says something like no comment or something like that. Anyway, Gisela, over to you. We've discussed that you would spend about 20 minutes introducing the subject, and then as usual, there will be ample time for questions and answers, and of course, comments. And I hope you will all stick like she does to the fair treatment of views that are not your own. So with that, the floor, or rather the screen, is yours, Gisela.
Thank you very much, Rupert, and greetings from a actually quite sunny London. The reason why I chose that particular title is because since 2016, virtually every conversation I've had with Germans would in various ways or another be like invitations to enter the confessional box. So as a good Bavarian Catholic, and as we're about approaching Lent, it was kind of that provided I sort of enter the room with the words, Father, forgive me for I have sinned, and then explain my sins and then express my deeper or less deeper regrets. That was a kind of the only conversation that was almost available. I have never had such a rich selection of Hassbriefe over the last 5 years, and believe it or not, they still come in. And they usually come in with postmarks from Liechtenstein or Switzerland, condemning the actions of bad Europeans. And I really thought it is worth reflecting from a British view, from a Bavarian. So I am familiar with exceptionalism, sitting in England and trying to explain the trajectory of what happened in the United Kingdom. Now, you may agree with it or you may not agree with it, but just try and follow me for a brief period, because even in the UK, when the referendum was called in 2016, there was only one fellow Labour member of Parliament who came up to me and said, she was a rather young one. She said, I'm really puzzled that you end up taking this position. Why? And I sent a couple of articles, and she came back and she said, I can see where you're coming from, but I just don't agree with, I can see your analysis. I just don't agree with your solution. And that tragically was Joe Cox, the Member of Parliament who was actually killed during the referendum. And the other thing which in 2016, I asked myself when the referendum was called, and remember, I wanted a referendum on the Lisbon Treaty because I thought you had a status quo, you had a future picture. If you're going to have a referendum, let's have it then. But I did ask myself, what would it take for me to be on the other side, and campaign for Remain? And that may have some relevance to the current political decision. And to me, it would have been if David Cameron had come back and said, the concept of deepening and widening has reached its logical limits. A European Union will exist of Euro member states which require deeper integration and non-Euro member states which require a different relationship. And at that point, I would have said, yeah, we can give that a try. And I think in our discussions about the Ukraine and the future, that may be something that kind of inability for the Union to have a relationship with its neighbors other than by offering them forms of membership, I think is something that requires a revisiting. But I just thought it is worth just recapturing what has happened in the UK in the last 5 years. I would compare it to, in other words, it would have been, in other times, it would have been Oliver Cromwell's Civil War. You've had a huge rupture of society challenging and expressing views. And the thing which has to me been so remarkable is actually how resilient the institutions have been. Because what you have to just recall, in 2016, on the 24th of June, the day after the referendum, the resignation of the Prime Minister was the third item in the news. The top item was this totally unexpected, by the commentariat, unexpected decision by the voters to leave the European Union. The second one was the crash of pound sterling. And the third one was, and the Prime Minister gone. The second one you could have expected to happen, given that 1 and 3 happened. But first of all, an unpreparedness for a referendum result, which should have been, some people should have been seen coming, and not even preparing for it. And a Prime Minister who says, I will do whatever you tell me to do, who responds to the result with resignation. At that moment, you had an extraordinary moment of where a parliamentary democracy came up against an unexpected result of a participatory democratic exercise, which he was utterly, utterly unprepared for. And if you were to go through the years between 16 and 19, you have a referendum, you have 2 general elections, the new Prime Minister who comes in. Quite remarkably, they managed to have a transition to Theresa May. She calls a general election because she thinks her majority is too small. And she ends up with a general election with an even smaller majority where she has to rely on the DUP votes. And you have votes in Parliament, several votes in Parliament, where in a brief period in 19, Parliament almost usurps the people and says it is our duty to do something other than what you have said. And we try to get a general election, that fails. Theresa May's deals fail. She triggers Article 50. And you finally have a general election in 2019, where despite what the institutions have done, the one thing which has not changed is the opinion of the voters by and large. Boris Johnson is returned with a majority of 18 members of parliament on one ticket, which is get Brexit done. So the voters haven't changed it. But then he, just to add to this sense of absolute revolution, he then prorogues parliament, is found having acted unlawful so you have to see the United Kingdom in that context. But the reason why I'd say that this almost in a sense started in 1973, because remember, I arrived in the United Kingdom in 1974. It was during the 3-day week. It was the closest to where in the last century, or probably ever, the British people had a moment when they lost faith in the capacity of the nation state to actually deliver. And therefore, to have recourse to something bigger and a greater union, a member state of a greater union, suddenly became actually very, very attractive. And therefore, you've got the joining in the 1973, which had two big consequences. The consequence for the continent of Europe is that by the United Kingdom leaving EFTA, it weakened the alternative of the political structures and how to relate to your neighbor states on the mainland of Europe. With a common market, it was a trading relationship with the ultimate aim of a political union. EFTA never was aiming for a political union. Britain leaves EFTA, joins with Denmark and Ireland, the common market, and therefore the choices had gone. The second one was in the United Kingdom. You had a process which, even during the first referendum in the 70s, never talked about sovereignty. Or very rarely, it was always seen as an economic exercise. And that's why it was so puzzling for mainland Europeans that, you know, the country that in the 80s with a single market and all those things probably drove through economic liberalization more than anything else, then goes off and says, no, this is no longer our game. And the only way you can understand that is the vote in 2016 and the subsequent leaving was about, on the one hand, community belonging and identity, and on the other hand, about what obligations you are prepared to enter as a member state of something that is larger. And what I think the United Kingdom in the end felt, there were some things where their courts and their parliament's ability to change things mattered to them more than actually economics. Now, some historians, and I have to say I kind of have a lot of sympathy with that, say geography comes before history. And I think you have to understand the geography of the British Isles, which may sound strange to the Germans, who, whenever I sort of tend to do sort of radio programs, which have got some personal background, they very often go and say, well, Mrs. Stuart, how long have you been on the island? And that's the moment when I'm reminded of the fact that the one people who tend to forget that they're on an island are actually the Brits. There's a very peculiar island blindness about it. But nevertheless, that is what has shaped them. And that ability to have the final say is so important. And if you look at British politics since 1974, since the official joining, at one stage, the issue of the European Union split the Labour Party. Tony Blair, the first time he stood for election was in 1983 on a Michael Foot manifesto, which said the Labour Party will withdraw from the common market. It then went and split the Tory party. Margaret Thatcher's fall in the end was Geoffrey Howe's resignation. It was the attitude to Euro. John Major's premiership was bedeviled by the Eurosceptics. Gordon Brown, remember, he went off and signed the Lisbon Treaty on his own. Everybody else went there, but Gordon, signed it with gritted teeth, but on his own. David Cameron thought, well, we can deal with it by just not talking about it. He literally, in his first speech as party leader, said, whilst everybody out there worries about their children's education, we, the Tories, bang on about Europe, and we're not going to. So he thought he could resolve this by just ignoring it. I think the only prime minister who, and I'm not a believer in lost opportunities and only if, and this looking back and thinking, oh, if only we had done things differently. However, I do think the only prime minister who could have had the place in history and the personal ability to direct the British path in a slightly different way was in my mind Tony Blair. And I always remember having a conversation with him when I was on the Convention on the Future of Europe. And at that moment, it was Tony Blair who was the first one. It was a British initiative to have a council president. And his thinking at that stage was if you want to have a proper structure which has got stability, the European Parliament is there for 5 years, the Commission is there for 5 years. The one institution which, if you want a proper balance of power that is fairly unstable by design, is the Council of Ministers, and therefore it requires something more significant. And remember, at the time, it was very much seen as a takeover by the big ones. Small countries objected. It was actually referred to as the ABC plan, the Aznavour Blair Chirac plan. The big beasts wanted to have their retirement place. And the Christmas before the Iraq invasion, I had to see Blair, and I said to him, well, he said to me, this getting the architecture right in the European Union is now the most important political decision we have to get through. And I jokingly said to him, you mean more important than what's happening in Iraq? And he said, Iraq's now going to happen whatever we do. But when it comes to Europe, we can shape it. And we must shape it. And of course, to me, it's one of the great unspoken of consequences of Iraq was Britain, we always assumed that Germany wouldn't join, but there was an expectation that France would. France didn't. There was a big fracture, there was a distraction, and a lot of the goodwill went. And I think that moment where I think you might have been able to create something which we haven't seen passed. And from then on, that two different trajectories, which to me still I would describe as Euro and non-Euro countries, the relationship by choice or the relationship by necessity, that trajectory just continued. And what is quite interesting to me, I have no idea what will happen to Ireland in a sense, because people predicting is always slightly tricky, but I think the challenge is that we have to make it work, because the notion that both sides, Northern Ireland and ERA, care deeply about maintaining peace I find it really quite upsetting that anybody thinks that the British mainland doesn't care about that. And the challenge there is that I fully understand why for the European Union, making leaving easy with sea borders doesn't cause too much problem. Making leaving easy with land borders is not in their interest. And rather perversely, the problems we now have in terms of Ireland plays into the current position in relation to Scottish independence. And whilst, as the regulator of the impartial civil service, however, I will allow myself two observations. And one is, and for German audience will find that more interesting, or I find it fascinating, is the total destruction of the Labour Party in Scotland. It was at one stage the dominant party. It was reduced out of 56 MPs, I think it was reduced down to 1. And the difficulty for recovery will be a bit like it was in Bavaria, when the Labour Party had been saying to me, well, what about the CSU and the CDU? Can we recover with a Scottish Labour sister party? And I had to point out to them rather uncomfortably that the CSU, as the sister party of the CDU, actually came out of the Bayernpartei. So arguably, when it comes to a centre-left party, the Labour Party already has a sister party in Scotland. It's just no longer called Labour. And that is a challenge. And the second challenge is that when I said at the beginning of obligations of being a member state, which is different from whether you join NATO or whether you join the WTO, it's when you become part of a union, and with those the obligations. The problem for a Scottish independence referendum is it will have to explain why the obligations of one union and benefits, the United Kingdom one, are less desirable than the benefits and obligations of another union called the European Union. But that is in the future, and that is probably as far as I can go on that subject without being accused of bias. But if you now look at the UK, and I finish with sort of just a couple of observations. Despite the upheaval, I think there's been a kind of the institutions have been more resilient than any of us thought. I think there's a desire to have the notion that the United Kingdom is now less European than it ever was before. I think people would find really quite offensive in a sense. What the future will hold, I think the last 72 hours have shown us that suddenly events happen and things change quite considerably. But my view still is, as I say, that you have now a more settled institutional structure politically. They will find new divisions, but the 50 years of Europe being the thing which divided the major political parties have gone. And I think even within the population, there are other divisions, but I don't think it will be Europe. Now, leave it at that, Rupert.
Okay. Thank you very much for this introduction. I think that's quite a lot of food for thought and food for comments and questions. There's been a bit of a conversation in the chat room already. Perhaps I can just start with one observation. We had a conference on what all this means for civil society, and we had one speaker from the UK, this was in 2018, who said, don't worry about the long term, because in the long term, the UK is absolutely certain to come back to the EU. Worry about how to bridge 10 years or perhaps 20 years. But in the long run, they will surely be back. I don't know whether he will be right. We will have to see. But I was amazed then that there is this position. What I find now is talking to British friends, and I've just done so again in England, is that people make a difference between leaving the EU as such and leaving it in the way that Britain did. And there's been a certain amount of discussion over the point, did it have to be as rigid as it was? Did it have to be so total in matters like Ireland, in matters of all kinds of regulations and things? What's your take on this?
I mean, in terms of Britain will come back, it's interesting. I read Michel Barnier's The Secret Diary, and he actually said that as late as 2018, Tony Blair was saying they're going to change their mind. And there was this extraordinary, there was this assumption that the only reason, well, first of all, the assumption that only the old, the stupid, and the racists voted for leave, which I would find quite frightening if 52% of the population fell into that category. And that once things were explained to them properly by those who know better, they would see the errors of the way. And it comes back to the confessional thing, so there was a, I always say it's like the 7 phases of grief, and one of them is denial, and then you get anger. In terms of did it have to be so brutal? Well, for me, it all comes back to the Convention on the Future of Europe. You see, the 3 things I'd wanted out of that convention and would have wanted to go into either constitution or what became the Lisbon Treaty. And one of them was for powers to be able to go to the center and for them to be able to return again. A constitutional mechanism for a two-way valve. And that isn't there. And I think what happened, there was a fear that if you left it's a bit like, if we're gonna get divorced and we keep the joint bank account and we still live in the same house, and it's just that, you know, I look after the children 2 days a week and you look after them the other 3. They felt you would not get a proper realization on both sides that the relationships have to change. I think when you have real ruptures like we had, it never happens just because of one side. I think there was on the British side, there was a touch of naivety that they thought they could. They were surprised by the unity of the 27. That, you know, the voice of industry would not go and drive through political things. And for a long time, you had a British negotiating team that actually was faced by people who had spent their entire political careers just thinking about that. You know, that team knew exactly what needed to be done. And you had a British team that probably hadn't been involved in negotiations for either never before or not for a long time. To me, one of the great, you know, if you were to say to me, you know, what do you think of national referendums? Well, they have their pros and cons if you're going to have them. But I don't think what you can have is a situation where the implementation of the result of a referendum is handed to a group of people who actually campaign for a different outcome. I mean, that is a real problem. And that's why when you then say to people, trust me, they go and say, but you were on the other side. And that was a problem.
Nick Jeffcott has put the question in the chat room, whether you would see advantages and disadvantages of Brexit to Britain and to the British people. Perhaps you could just take us through the two sides of it for a moment.
It kind of assumes that I mean, first of all, what I didn't address is, could I see Britain coming back? To which I say, you never step into the same river twice. You know, the European Union is changing in front of us, and it requires to change, and so does the UK. But the advantage and disadvantages, it comes back to you think it's a mercantile economic question. If it was just about size of markets, then size of markets, movement of people, all those kind of things, if it was an economic question. But, you know, human society is about so much more than economics. And the curious thing is that the things which at the end of the day really matter and give a society its resilience and its need, you know, its ability to survive, is actually never about economics. And that's why what I would say, it's the advantages, well, let's say the disadvantages are, yeah, you're dealing with a system of highly integrated supply chains which are being seriously disrupted. Brexit and COVID together actually makes it quite difficult to sort of really allocate where it is. We have to do things differently, and change is painful. At the same time, the advantages is that it's a kind of ownership of what society you choose to live in. And, you know, this may sound off-piece, but allow me to just make that big observation. There are such things as natural laws, and I can, you know, if I talk about the law of gravity, we can't argue whether, you know, what it is and what it isn't. There is no such thing as a science of society. It is a trial and error system, which every generation and every group of people at a particular time come up with the best solution. And the virtue of democracy for me is that you ever so often give one lot a go and say, you have a go. And then it is the people who remove them at will and say, and now we try something else. And that sense, I think you couldn't put a monetary value on it.
There are one or two questions in the chat that sort of look at our very present situation, war in Ukraine, and sort of say that in a way, the ongoing relationship between the UK and the rest of Europe is now being put to a test, because quite obviously the whole of Western Europe will have to stand by Ukraine. Would you think it is appropriate that the UK and the rest of Europe sort of stand together, or would you think this is another occasion for the UK to sort of have its very own sort of position?
Well, I'm choosing my words very carefully now. Where's Norway in all this? I mean, are they not European? Discuss we really have to be clear that when we say Europe, that is actually bigger and more important and wider than the union of the European Union. And what we have now is not Russia versus the EU and the UK. What we have is the North Atlantic Alliance. We have a security arrangement which was set up and if you, historically, if you go back again, the post-World War II deal was very clear. It was about military protection via NATO and economic stability by making sure Germany and France peacefully coexist, and a Germany that regains its economic importance, but not one that requires to be militarily constrained. So the real thing is about the North Atlantic Alliance. And what has been amazing, what I think is to me interesting, and I look forward to understanding and seeing more, that it started under President Obama, that in a sense, it wasn't quite clear to what extent the Americans were, their commitment to it. And remember, I remember in 1998 going to Birmingham University, and there was a session between NATO plus, and there was the Russian military there, and we thought it wasn't needed anymore. How many countries are actually spending 2% on defense, which is the NATO obligation? 2004, I remember traveling in Warsaw and Prague, and the really big thing actually was not the EU membership for countries. I think Poland already wasn't, but it was the Prague summit on NATO, who will be taken into NATO. And to them, a lot of the former Eastern European countries, for them at that stage in their history, NATO membership actually was by far more important and significant than the European Union. So if we get up back to NATO membership, contributions, military capacity, and I think politically, there has been some really good coordination to doing that. So it's not EU versus UK and Georgia, it's NATO.
There's quite an ongoing discussion in the chat, and I invite you all to sort of have a look from time to time, because there are a lot of comments in there which we can't all sort of take on here. But let's just get back to the Brexit issue that we're discussing tonight. And there's one remark here which I think it should be read out, and it says, many Europeans cannot believe that 5 years after the 2016 referendum, the benefits, in inverted commas, of Brexit have to be clarified by the new Brexit benefits minister, Jacob Rees-Mogg. What's your take on that?
Well, you're now taking me into contemporary politics. There are two ways in which you could describe that particular position. If you're in a political position where, for your internal and presentational purposes, you still require to use the word Brexit, then you would describe it as Brexit benefits. You could also say, given that this is a country that for 40 years has not done its own trade deals because there was an EU competence, and you actually have a skills gap, and there are certain things which you as a country haven't done for such a long time, and actually that is what you have to regain. And you had made it the Minister for Future Trade Opportunities, then that is a different kettle of fish. And as to the 5-year, Rupert, you yourself were saying that in 2018 there were still some people who were going saying, no, don't worry, just don't do anything. They'll come back. And then just at the moment that you had the general election with a big majority and a cabinet that was focused on that, we've had 2 years of COVID, which changed things completely for everyone.
Yeah. But this obviously couldn't be sort of foreseen when the referendum and the whole development started. Now, here's a provocative one for you. How do you envisage the UK regaining international influence and respect? This, of course, implies that it lost it, which I don't know whether you'd agree to that one in the first round.
Rupert, in the introduction, you said that I'd been to a number of Königswinter conferences, and I've been to them long enough to know that in regular interval, one or other is on the couch, as I used to describe it. That the Brits would look at the Germans and go and say, how could you do this? And then 2 years later, the Germans go to the Brits and say, what a mess, how could you? So it's the ups and downs of politics. And but if you were to turn this on its head, where does international influence come from? Influence and respect, actually two different things. Respect is something which other people think you deserve, and you can only do that by your conduct, and you just have to wait until they either give it to you or don't give it to you. Influence, I always thought that Britain was only ever influential on the European scene when it was economically more successful in relative strengths than Germany or France were. And of course, it had its influence on the defense side simply because it had more military capacity. Currently, if I were to look at influence, it's the German word is probably better for that. It's finessed. I think the Brits, in terms of either its diplomatic representations or its membership of international institutions, is still pretty much second to none. Now, what had happened over a number of years is that our diplomatic services, I think if you looked at the amount of money that was being spent on that, kind of had been quite weakened. And I think, if I were to compare the way German industry would be at the heart of a lot of German, embassies around the place, and that's something which I think you will find is coming much more to the fore. But Britain is still enormously represented in masses of institutions, and if I were to give advice to the future thing, one thing the Brits actually are pretty good at is being rules and standard setters, to create rules which are enablers, but not constrainers. And that's a pretty good skill, which they've had for a long time and continue to have.
Paul Samengo, who's in the audience, wasn't quite happy with what you were saying earlier. So he says, if I understand your answer, there are at this point no identifiable benefits. Was that what you were implying?
Well, if you regard democracy to not to be an identifiable benefit, then Paul has a point. But for some people, whilst you can't put a pound sign on this, I think what has in the British eyes been the common thread for 40, 50 years in relationship to the European Union has what they felt an inability of democratic accountability. And to me, it means you change the government and you change the policies. So some people will tell me that to have directly elected members of parliament is a important democratic sign, to which I say, yes. But if you don't have pan-European parties, so that I actually know what a member of the European Socialists stands for, and I can actually make on my ballot box a decision, because voting is taking sides. You do a trade-off between one set of values against another one. And that is something you will find the Brits just has never really happened within the European Union.
Well,
I see I'm getting rather dark. Do I need to switch on some lights, or can you still see me? No, maybe it looks like a halo, really. So we'll leave that one.
We can still just see you, but perhaps we should give you a moment to turn on the light somewhere.
Turn on the lights. Yeah. So give me a second.
Yes, that's better.
Is that better?
Yes, it is. Yes, it is.
The 3-day week has ended.
Yeah, yeah. Very good. Edith Riegler says here, the EU has done trade deals with various countries, e.g. Japan, South Africa, New Zealand, Vietnam, Singapore, Australia during COVID. The US federal government declined a trade deal with the UK. So the UK now has to negotiate individual trade deals with individual states and the US, and it lacks trade negotiation competence. So is Brexit really benefiting the UK, obviously in the difficult situation of COVID? Was it David Davis who said concluding trade deals would be easy peasy?
Yeah, I mean,
I'm just quoting.
Yeah. But we just keep going back to this was just about trade deals. If there are two things which I cannot stress enough is the 2016 vote was not about trade, and the second one is if it had been a case of that, upon reflection, the British people kind of took a look and woke up one morning and went, what have we done? We had 3 years which involved 2 more general elections where the British people did not change their mind. It really is,
Yeah. Okay, let's just pick another one. This is sort of goes backwards and forwards a bit, but that's how it goes if we have it online. The EU in the last days has both reached in an unexpectedly swift and far-reaching manner and also expanded into an area few would have thought likely, namely security policy. With a clearly mounted threat for Europe, will this provide a need for greater cooperation in this field between the EU, with the French nuclear force, and the UK? And will the UK be interested and willing to do this?
I always find this really curious that defense, which was the one thing which wasn't an EU capacity, is so often then quoted as now being something which we've lost. Let's just go back to something very, very fundamental. I have lost count of the number of years in which the 50,000 European Rapid Reaction Force has failed to materialize. We have talked about it for longer than I care to remember. However, what matters in terms of military capacity, in terms of defense, is actually capacity. And what I think has been remarkable and welcome and I really do mean that, is a step in spending and realizing the investment in defense which is required. And the reason why that is something which the UK and France and Germany and the EU will have to do together, because the price, the key thing which neither of us can afford, is for the United States to lose interest in the North Atlantic Alliance. And if we don't step up to the plate and invest, then interoperability of whatever weapon systems we have, whatever tanks we have, whatever ships we have, and aircraft carriers, if that is not interoperable with the United States of America, we in Europe will be the losers. And it's so as I say, the last 72 hours in particular, I think we've seen a massive shift. And of course, the one country that had to shift in that sense has been Germany. And I found the whole withdrawal of Afghanistan enormously distressing at the best of times. I found it equally distressing at that time, because I went back and thought, you know, Schröder put his chancellorship on the line by having a vote to allow the German troops to be part of ISAF. People have forgotten just how many German soldiers were actually in Afghanistan. And I thought, I do hope that this does not lead to Germany really withdrawing even further into saying this is not something we deal with. Ukraine has shown that this hasn't been the case. And I just think it is collectively so important for all of us that defense is our responsibility, but quite frankly, without close cooperation with the US, we won't be able to do it.
Mm. Now, I have one question here, which I don't really understand, and perhaps Professor Juliet Lodge, who put it here, might just turn on her microphone and tell us. It says here, foreign interference put pound signs on undermining democracy. Is Juliet Lodge here, and could she explain? No, she doesn't. Seems to have left us, so we'll have to leave it at that. Or do you know what she implied?
Well, I don't know. I mean, no. And it could be this continuous about is there Russian interference? Is Russia buying influence in the UK? And you know, my answer to that is there may be all sorts of attempts of trying to interfere, but I have not seen, and you can disrupt, but I have not seen any evidence that there have been any different outcomes. When it comes to influence in the civic life and democratic institutions, I think I'm less worried about Russia than I am about its neighbor, quite frankly.
Mm, mm. Will you think, and this of course touches on your present position, will you think that the UK government will have to sort of reorganize the whole setup of government in order to be able to cope with what now faces the government of the UK rather than the European Commission? I mean, to be on one's own does mean that one has to cope with a lot of problems, which one might palm off on somebody else if one's with others. Would you think there's still a lot to do in that respect? Would you think there's...
It's actually less that. It's the, you know, that's sort of after sort of 50 years here, there's just some things where I look and I say, these are the bits the other side will never understand. There are differences. And the one thing which is, ich nenne das immer kreative Schlampigkeit. Give the British system a crisis and it's brilliant. It is absolutely brilliant. It steps up to the plate. It comes up with challenging new ways of things. Give them boring daily routine competence, you know, the equivalent of preventive maintenance of the machinery of democracy, and they just lose lose interest. And I think the challenge for the British system is that it has become quite creaky in a sense. I think during COVID in particular, the population sort of looked at how Amazon could deliver things, and they were saying, well, you know, if this guy can just deliver things, and I can have my missing avocado and lemon delivered for thing, you know, why does the state need 15 forms to fill in? So I think democracy, the legitimacy of democracy as a provider of services in exchange for demanding taxation, is a challenge that's going to face all of us. And I think it particularly will face the British system, because with our health service and increasingly looking at care being paid out of current taxation, will require some demands, and the under 35s as consumers of the product called democracy expected to become by far more responsive than it has been. So the second challenge, which just using very much the British system, is also the use of data, in the sense that we have, because the world is changing so quickly around us, we've got into a system where we use data in order to justify existing policy decisions. And I think we need by far more people who can use data in order to identify future need for policy intervention. And in that context, the biggest challenge for England, and I use the word England deliberately here, is the devolution of power within England outside London. So, you know, Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland, you've got system, London's got it. Outside London, I think that's where the challenge is going to come.
You've now raised the point which has been raised here too. Is this really about democracy, or is it about the nature and position of the state, which is something that is being quite hotly debated all over the world? Should the state be sort of above everybody, or is the state a service provider? And it's really the citizens that should be given back control. Is that's not the same thing as talking about democracy?
But you very much raise what I think is at the heart of this. I mean, remember, you know, 30 years ago, Fukuyama told us that, you know, the history had ended, and we the Guardian reading liberal Democrats, we had decided that, you know, humanity had reached the perfect form, you know, our form of liberal democracies, and the rest of the world, all we had to do is just show them of who we were, what we stood for, and everybody would only want one thing, and that is they would want to become like us. That has proved not to be the case. And as to what, and remember 30 years ago, even Russia and China were going through the motions of wanting to appear like democracies. You know, you had, that has gone. I think that realization that humanity has accepted liberal democracies to be its fallback position, and that, to me, is something I will go on fighting for, because I happen to think it is the best means for expressing what I think humanity stands for. But then that gives you that challenge of because no one can ever get what they want, how do you form a consensus to strike the compromises of you know, who's going to pay for the defense of Ukraine? Who's going to pay for building prisons? Now, if you've got always, you know, phone in and vote, are we going to have this? Are we going to have that? Yeah, you know, you can make everybody take part, but you will not get big decisions to be made and structural decisions to be made. And I see it in particular. Give you an example. In 2017. After that election, I was at that stage, I had stepped down from Parliament. I still felt some residual responsibility for Brexit. I thought the government really wasn't handling this properly. and we set up a think tank to sort of, start to have a voice in that. And we did an analysis of 2017 election result. And I looked at the vote of the under 35s, and I thought this was really, I couldn't make sense of it. Because remember, that's when Jeremy Corbyn was the leader of the Labour Party. And we saw under 35s who voted for three, to me, completely inconsistent things. They wanted to nationalise the rail service. They loved the NHS, but they didn't believe in the contributory principle of the pension system. And I thought, are these Thatcher's children? Are these Corbyn's children? I mean, what are they? And we did some more digging, and it turned out to be very, very straightforward. They didn't believe in the contributory principle of the pension system because they thought by the time they retire, which probably won't be when they're 65, 68 or 70, probably in the early 70s, if ever there was a pot of money, there won't be anything left. They wanted to nationalise the railways, not because they wanted to return the means of production to the workers. They just thought, it used to be nationalised, then you privatised it. It's now rubbish and costs a lot. You might as well try the other lot again. And they loved the NHS is because it was the one institution, whatever its failings, that actually embraced the entire population. And it was based on a principle which they felt was fair. It was one according to need and not according to ability to pay. So the challenge for democracy, I think, is actually twofold. One is our political party structures in terms of what they stand for is no longer in line with, that's why you see the changes. I mean, this is why I watch with fascination what's happening to the German Greens, where do they end up, or the Scottish SNP. So the parties, which are usually the bodies where you coalesce around ideas, who have hugely important regulatory functions. Their regulatory function is to blunt the extremes, to absorb, to bring groups together. That compared with the sheer force of the market, if Amazon so much better, if Jeff Bezos can send his people into space and have his, what do I need the state for? And the one thing, and this may sound going to sound really, really slightly unhinged, so forgive me, but I'm going to say it nevertheless. There was a very interesting profile of Jeff Bezos, and someone said, what makes him so successful? What you've worked with him, what makes it so extraordinary? What does he do which no one else does? And he said, he fails so much quicker and so much better than anybody else does. If you want to bring innovation, you need to try things, and you need to be very quick at saying, does this work? If it doesn't work, then go new. And this is the challenge for governments and the state, because if you look at democracy, democracy has got two functions. It has to, on the one hand, prevent tyranny. And on the other hand, it's got to make sure that things happen. And the spectrum is sort of in between. So therefore, it's clunkier, it's slower, it appears unresponsive. And that's something which I think that's the biggest challenge, I think.
There's actually a comment here on just that point from Edith Riegler, who says, I would suggest that the under 35s expect a fully functional National Health Service, avoiding the cost of living crisis and providing the right for self-determination in Northern Ireland and Scotland, i.e. democracy and devolved powers. I think that's probably it in a nutshell. They expect that things work and that they have a say in it, and don't worry too much about the sort of the big sort of structures. But as we're sort of getting to the end of our time, I did want to put in a question here, which is, of course, very interesting for us. And the question comes from Nicholas Wareham from the British Embassy. He says, what's your advice to organizations like the Deutsch-Britische Gesellschaft interested in UK-German relations? How best can they support deeper ties in this new context?
Well, in that case, I shall now briefly wear one of my other hats, and that's my Wilton Park hat. Wilton Park is an executive agency of the Foreign Office, and the guy who's the chief executive there, Tom Cargill, he used to work for British foreign policy, and Tom Tom's idea, and I've always kind of supported this, was foreign policy is actually domestic. So we kind of have seen that, if you want to have direct flights to India from the Midlands, that is actually as much as a foreign policy as a question of the diaspora, as a question of your trade links. And saying that to the Germans seems like, what is she on about? It's like second nature. In Germany, your local chamber of commerce, you kind of cities, but you just haven't had that in England. I can tell you one of my life's most embarrassing moments was when Birmingham established direct flights to Chicago, and the mayor of Chicago met the mayor of Birmingham, and that was this massive, big, powerful person that actually made economic decisions in Chicago and was running the city, compared to the ceremonial function of the mayor of Birmingham, who at that stage had a very pretty gold chain, and they would do it for a year and could do a very good impersonation of "and have you come far?" And it's that bit. So the advice, I think, would be is to me the most hopeful thing that's happening, and it's happening in a very random and very British way, and that is the regional mayors, which are beginning to carve out their own authorities. I think they're the future for the economic developments. If I sat in Germany, I would go and I'd talk to Andy Burnham in Manchester, Andy Street in the West Midlands, Ben Houchen in Middlesbrough, the Liverpool one. I can see him in front of me. He used to be a colleague. It's those figures I would go, because the whole program, of which they call Levelling Up, is about giving genuine economic decision powers. The civil service, we are committed to moving 20% of the civil service outside of London. So 500 Home Office jobs are going to Stoke-on-Trent. Inland revenue is going on to Darlington. But these things will only work if they get locked into the local economy. And so if I was, I'd go to the chambers of commerce, like the Birmingham one, which is a good one, and those mayors and their economic portfolio, because that's where the future changes. They will do things differently, and I can get really excited about that.
Okay, thank you very much, because that's exactly what we're sort of thinking about at the moment. We're going to have a little sort of meeting of the various German-British societies all over Germany within the next few months to talk about how we're going to sort of work on German-British relations in these new surroundings and circumstances. But now my final question, and it's actually yours, and you haven't answered it yet. In 50 years' time, what will be seen as more remarkable, that the UK joined in 1973 or that it left in 2019? What's your prediction?
That it joined. I think is that it joined. And it goes back to that it, without having articulated to itself or to its people a supranational membership, which required a handing over of the final word. And that was something which I think the Brits, and this is where the fact that it is an island nation does matter. I always remember when if you try to if you're German, even if you're Bavarian, they fought on the French side during the Napoleonic Wars, and then it was a question of whether they would go with the Austrians, and then whether whilst the Grundgesetz may have been written on was it Frauenchiemsee or Herrenchiemsee, where it was written, but the Bavarians wouldn't sign it. But because it's a federal state, the majority binds the minority. Your boundaries are movable feast. That shapes you, and therefore, I think the worst thing we can do is assume that one system is better than another. It is not. It's a question of what is most appropriate to you at a given time. And that's the best you can do in a democracy.
Mm.
And Andreas, who I see him on the picture, and I thought I must say that. And Andreas, you're absolutely right. Andreas says the Irish see that quite differently. Last time I checked, they were an island too, and you are right. And the thing which, as a foreigner, I had kind of, if you look at the history of Ireland, where it was that 1916 break the other way. And Andreas, you're absolutely right. The Irish do see it differently, and it's one of those close and like close relationships. It has its troubles. When I came to Birmingham, and you would know that Andreas, in the 90s, 20% of Birmingham's population either were Irish or thought of themselves as Irish.
Mm.
That has diminished. The voting rights for Ireland are still, when it comes to British general elections or things, the Irish are treated like UK citizens are, and so it is a relationship that has long, deep roots, and the key thing for me is that it has to be peaceful.
Thank you. That was a good way of summing it up. In any case, thank you very much indeed. This has been an extraordinarily lively and interesting discussion. I'm very sorry, and I apologize to those in the audience whose questions I sort of didn't manage to include, but I hope you all sort of took a moment to look at the chat and see what other people had commented. So this has been certainly sort of a good way of discussing this issue. You said in the beginning that you compared the whole process to the Civil War in the 17th century. I'd never thought of it like that, but I must say, yes, it resonates. It is a major, very major sort of new starting point. The only thing I would say is it took them 12 years and they got Charles II back. So perhaps there is hope. Thank you very much, Gisela. This has been wonderful. Thank you very much indeed. And we'll certainly be in touch, and we'll see each other at other occasions. Thank you all very much for joining, and see you hopefully next time. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.